I think if someone were to ask me which time in history would you go back to if you had a chance to use a time machine, I think there's one point in history which I think I would certainly go back to because it seems to me a crucial point. And it's the time of the New Testament, time of Jesus, the time of Easter, or what was called then Passover, then, as to the events that took place at that time. Because it seems to me that there is probably no more important question to answer, probably in the whole of human history, than the question of the fundamental claim of the Christian church, which is that Jesus Christ rose again at Easter time on the third day after his crucifixion. Now, it doesn't matter whether you believe in that or whether you don't, but you'd have to understand, I think, that if this is true, then it's probably the most momentous event in human history. And if it's not true, then we ought to know it. So I think I would go back to that point then. And it's interesting to examine the accounts of that crucial focal point in human history. And there are a number of questions which, it seems to me, come out of an analysis of the accounts. We have four accounts. We have the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Mark being the earliest and John being the latest. And they all shed a slightly different light on the crucial events of that time. And there are certain questions which come out, and I wanted to deal with some of those questions over this Easter period to try to just look and see what they were. And the first question which comes to my mind, particularly before the actual crucifixion event takes place, is the betrayal of Judas. Judas is a figure which I have to confess I really don't understand. I don't understand the motivation and the way in which, well, maybe he killed himself at the end, and how at one point he could be so clear-cut as to betray a master and then within a very short space of time be so filled with remorse that he kills himself. Leave that to one side for just a moment, because I want to look at a smaller and more interesting question. It's well known from all the accounts that when Judas betrayed Jesus, he led a party of the temple guard under cloak and cover of nighttime to the garden at Gethsemane and betrayed Jesus at that point and handed Jesus over to the guard. So much is on the surface, and it's so clear-cut and plain. But when you peer below the surface, there are questions here which don't at first sight have any clear answers to them. And the question I want to ask here is, how did Judas know where to lead the temple guard? How did Judas know where he would find Jesus? How did Judas know that? Well, it's interesting because you might say, well, isn't it pretty obvious? I think that it was the custom and practice during that week leading up to Passover. Jesus left the city and went to stay in Bethany. Yeah, he did. Fair enough. And it was probably his custom and practice to stay a while in the Garden of Gethsemane on the way. That's one part of the route. That may have been customary. Fair enough. It may well have been. But the events of this particular night are different and unusual. They start in the upper room late Thursday after supper. And Jesus indicates to the disciples that one of them will betray him. John, the disciple who is closest to Jesus, asks him who it is. And Jesus says, it's the person who, when I dip this bread into the bowl and offer it to them, he is the one. And he dipped the bread into the bowl and he offered it to Judas. And Judas looked at Jesus, and Jesus looked at Judas as he took the thing. And it says here that at that point Satan entered into Judas, and Jesus said to him, "Go and do what you have to do." Now that's important because that means there's an understanding between the two. Jesus knows that Judas is going to betray him. And Judas knows that Jesus knows that too. That's interesting in and of itself. Judas knows that Jesus knows. And there's an understanding between them here at that point where Jesus says, "Go and do what you have to do, and do it quickly." So, this is not a kind of a normal betrayal. This is not a betrayal where we didn't know what was going to go on. And neither was it a normal betrayal in the sense that Judas thought he was doing something behind the scenes which was going to take Jesus by surprise, because no, he didn't. There's an understanding between these two. Judas goes off. He goes off and talks to Caiaphas or the high priest or whoever it is and says that I'm now ready to betray Jesus. And Judas knows where he's going to lead them. But, and here is the important and significant point for us today, there's a delay. The high priests and the leaders of the Jews are not ready. They're taken by surprise. It's going to take them some while to amass the forces. It's not simply a matter of sending out the temple guard. They have to arrange a trial. They have to make sure that the trial will go according to plan. And according to plan is they wish to have Jesus killed and crucified. Now, the only people who could do that were, of course, the Romans. They had taken sole power of life and death decisions in this matter away from the Jews. So they had to have Pontius Pilate making that judgment. And would he do so? Well, presumably they had to spend some time going in the middle of the night to that particular place. Now, you have to think that we're talking about late at night. This is after the supper had finished. This is after many discourses and speeches had been given, after the foot washing had taken place. And we're looking at a time when it was getting probably 11 o'clock, maybe later than 11 o'clock, that kind of time. Judas goes out. He's urging these people, come, we're going to meet Jesus at the Garden of Gethsemane, and I'll identify him to you then and there. But the delay is the important point here. The delay is such that it's taking Judas a long time, maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours, maybe 3 hours. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning of Friday, they're waiting, probably consulting with Pontius Pilate, getting all the witnesses together, trying to see if they can get this trial done. And Jesus crucified before sundown on Friday, which is when the Passover begins. Now, what happens in the Garden of Gethsemane, even if Jesus went there? Even if he went there every evening on his way back to Bethany and waited, this was unusual. It was unusual because he forced them to stay there much longer than ever before. You remember that they're waiting and waiting and waiting so much longer that they fall asleep. And he comes back and rebukes them, couldn't you keep awake for a while? And he goes away again and prays. And then they fall asleep again. And he comes back and rebukes them again. And then they fall asleep again. These are strong people, probably fishermen who are used to lonely nights vigils on things. They must have been incredibly tired to have fallen asleep 3 times. And it's quite clear that they're being kept in this garden, kept away from their beds by the sheer will of Jesus Christ at this point. For how long? Probably a couple of hours or so to have fallen asleep like that. We're talking then about Jesus being in that garden far, far longer than he would normally have been there. They'd have normally been in their beds by now. When Judas comes marching back, where does he think he's going to find Jesus? strangely enough, he knows he's going to find him in the garden, even at this late time. That's where he leads them. He knows he's going to be there, despite the fact that Jesus should have gone from there a long time ago. Jesus should have taken them back to their beds hours ago. But Judas does not lead them to Bethany where they were resting. He leads them to the garden because he knows that they'll be there, even though he's taken far, far, far longer. No matter how long Judas is going to take, he knows that Jesus is going to be there waiting for him. What does that mean? Well, it means that there was an understanding between them. It can be explained no other way, it seems to me. That Jesus held people there for as long as it would take because he knew that Judas was coming to this particular spot. And Judas led them to this particular spot, no matter how long it took, and was quite confident that Jesus had not moved on somewhere else. This was no taking Jesus by surprise issue. Judas knew that. Jesus knew it too, and the two must have agreed that this would take place at this time. So that's an interesting observation that we need to take on board here. That how did Judas know how to find Jesus in the garden? Because Jesus had agreed with Judas beforehand. And he would wait for as long as he needed to get the guard to come and to take him as arrested. The nature of the question then becomes, what kind of agreement did they have? What kind of understanding was there between Jesus and Judas? Well, it was certainly an understanding as to betrayal and location and place. And even if not time. And then the question then becomes, well, if they had agreed that, what was Judas thinking that he was doing? Wasn't a betrayal in the normal sense of the word if there was an agreement to it of some kind, an agreed location? Why would Jesus prompt such a thing and go along with such a thing? What would be the reason for setting up an agreement with Judas in order to be betrayed at this place? We can't but do anything but speculate on that. And speculation is, of course, a probabilistic matter. I may be completely wrong. But it seems to me that there's a good reason why Jesus might have prompted this, not simply because he was giving himself up in order to be crucified, but because it may well have been that there was a bargain going on here. This is, as I say, wild speculation on my part, but there may well have been a bargain here that the chief priests, they had decided to put an end to Jesus' ministry. They were going to round up Jesus and maybe the ringleaders and crucify them and have them killed. But somehow or other, Jesus was determined to save his followers, and said so quite plainly in many occasions. Man has no greater love than this, that he lays down his life for his friends. And one can understand this in the context that if you take me alone, I will surrender myself willingly, will offer no resistance at all, provided that you leave my disciples untouched and unharmed and do not arrest them. That could be the nature of the bargain that Judas had gone to offer to the high priests. After all, the question is, why did they bother to need Judas at all? Why did they need to have someone identify one of the most public figures of the time? Well, maybe he wasn't just simply identifying Jesus. Maybe he was conveying the idea that Jesus was now ready to surrender himself upon condition that all the disciples were let go free, and he would wait there, wait in the Garden of Gethsemane for as long as it took in order to do that.